Jamie, you are becoming the master of recruiting, managing, training, nurturing, and developing some really, really great senior client managers. Where should we start? Because this is such an important role in the deep and narrow team structure, arguably one of the hardest roles to get right in the team structure. So when we start thinking about high performing habits of senior client managers, we have to kind of go back to the whole team structure itself. And talk to us about, scaling the business successfully and why this role is so important to that.
Yeah, thanks, Brenton. Look, from my research and studying, working with Ed over the years, it's really a middle management level. So in any organisation or any firm, middle management can be one of the hardest roles to fill. Mm-hmm. And the reason is, I think it's just because of the skill set that you need, particularly in an accounting or bookkeeping firm, that you need in order to manage the clients. And the most critical, if you sort of had to give it context, important skill to have in terms of the senior client manager role is managing clients' expectations. Mm-hmm. And it's, in that sense, it's quite a few sort of pointers. One that you'd mention is, first seek to understand before being understood. So you've got to be a great listener. You've really got to be a great listener. You've got to, under promise and over deliver. That's another absolute critical one, is under promise and over deliver. And everyone knows what that means. The worst thing you can do is over promise and under deliver. So, we'll touch on some of those things in today's session, but there's a couple of critical ones, Brenton, and particularly is just managing clients' expectations. Because if you don't manage the client's expectations, when it comes to fees, when it comes to when the job's going to be done, how the job's going to process, whether it's bookkeeping or tax or whatever it may be, if you're not managing the client's expectations, you will lose the clients. And everyone listening would have experience of a fee complaint, for example. Now, you've got a fee complaint. How do you deal with that? Why did that occur in the first place? Did you communicate? Did you effectively communicate up front in the sales process what the fee is, when the work's going to be done? Yeah. So these sort of things are absolutely critical, Brenton, that when you're looking to hire senior client managers, that some of these skills, particularly managing the client expectations, is the main point.
So we'll have a good combination of people listening in who either are a senior client manager themselves, are looking to find the right senior client manager, or have the right senior client manager on board and want to know how to nurture that role and really get the most out of that role and help develop that person. But I want to go one level higher before we get into some of the nuts and bolts of that stuff, because you wouldn't be able to do what you're doing now, certainly with Wize and everything like that, if you didn't nail down getting this role right and really sort of putting laser focus into putting the time and energy in developing these roles. So talk to me a little about the impact that this role has on you as the CEO and the owner in your ability to fulfill what we promised, which is have the business run without you.
Yeah, it's one of the single biggest decisions you'll make is to implement a senior client manager. And that's purely because of all the communication traffic and the production traffic that's done in a firm. And once you structure that ideal team and you put in a senior client manager to look after all that communication traffic, it simply frees up the owner's time. So in my case, for example, it just literally freed up my time. Instead of, working in the business, I could work on it. And when you say, well, work on it, what is that? Working on it is putting essentially the quad 2 activities that we always speak about in Dr. Stephen Covey's book. You know, it's not urgent, but it's important. Whereas if you don't do that, Brenton, you're gonna live in urgent important, which is putting out fires all the time.
Yeah.
And so once you fulfill these roles, it allows the owner to put in systems, procedures, policies. It allows you to recruit correctly for the teams that you have to build. And ultimately, once you've got your foundations in place, it then allows you to look at acquisitions and buy a parcel of fees. And, you know, it's great to be part of a firm that's growing. In a growing firm, there's opportunity for everyone. Essentially, there's opportunity, there's more challenges, there's essentially more challenges and rewards. So to be part of a firm that's dynamic, that's moving, that's growing, that's a really interesting place to be for any team member or employee. It's always great not to sort of, you know, just to stay still where you're at, and particularly to have that bigger vision. And, you know, I'm always communicating with all of our staff at some point or another about what our vision is, where our goals are, what we need to get to, but then also taking an active interest in each individual person's career path and their goals as well. And essentially, where are they best in their flow as well? And so, you know, and a lot of that's just sort of like leadership, and that was what I learned from Ed over the years.
Yeah. Let's talk about a little bit then about sort of demything some of the issues around this role, because there's a lot of concern and fear when it comes to certainly this role being a leadership role, being a client-facing role. When recruiting or developing out the person that fulfills the seat, there's a lot of concern around, you know, the person walking away with client fees, or, you know, the client's not being happy dealing with this person and not the owner anymore. So demyth this for us, because you've done this over the last couple of years.
Yeah, so essentially when in my own shoes, when I transitioned all the clients, and, you know, people have to remember that I started my own firm, you know, just by myself from the garage, pretty much the same as Ed. And, you know, so a lot of the clients were friends, they were family, and, you know, after some years, you really get to know the clients at a, you know, quite detailed level. And so, you know, my approach was that, you know, if the firm was going to grow, then I had to change my thinking. That was first point. And secondly, then I had to sort of change my actions and put the foundations in place so that I could grow the firm. And, you know, essentially what that happened is, once I'd found the right people, the senior client managers who had the right characteristics, had the right skills, I essentially then introduced every client to that senior client manager, and slowly but surely handed those clients over. And, you know, in that process, I honoured the no bypass policy. And, you know, essentially I didn't, once I'd introduced the client to that person, I didn't bypass that senior client manager. If the client rang me, I would often circle the client back into a 3-way conference call, and I would say, "Hey Joe, you know, I've got such and such on the line now. Just say it's Rick. Rick, what do you think?" So always circle the senior client manager back into the process. Okay. And the same as emails. Now, just to finish that, you know, it's the same as the adoption curve. Some of the clients, you know, Ed would call them rubber cup clients. They were loosely easygoing, and they were early adopters, and they would go across to the senior client manager without a problem. Then you sort of had your middle adopters, where you might just need to circle them back to the senior client manager a second or a third time. And then you had your late adopters. So some of the late adopters essentially might have been quite fearful that, you know, I haven't got Jamie anymore, you know, and you know, there was probably 1 or 2% of the clients, well, if I can't have you, I can't have, you know, I'll go somewhere else. Now, you will get some of those clients, they'll be a very small percentage, but the question you have to ask as a firm owner am I going to, create my whole destiny and the outcomes of the growth of my firm based on 2% of the client base? And, I remember asking Ed that question. And again, it always comes back to the 80-20 rule. So yeah, that's the journey you'll take on, and you'll have your rubber cup clients or your early adopters, and then you'll have your crystal glass clients who just won't want any change. And that's just because the way they are. So that gives you a bit of an idea of the exact experience I had and the practicality. But the worst thing you can do is find a senior client manager and then out of bad habit, bypass them. What we mean by bypass them is speak to the client and instruct the client what to do. Yeah. The same token applies, Brenton, where you speak to the senior client manager's team and tell them what to do without telling the senior client manager. So
there's a lot of sort of personal restraint that has to go on there, because certainly from the owner's perspective, having been set in their ways and having been in control or attempting to be in control of the firm, to that point, it's a fairly big behavior shift to move into that territory, and there's a big transfer of trust there as well. Did you find that hard yourself?
I didn't, because I think of the pain that I went through in the earlier years, of working 6 and at some point 7 days a week. I'd had a young family, and, just staying the same wasn't an option for me. I just didn't, there was 2 things for me. One was the trauma of just doing 70, 80 hours a week. And, the other side of the coin was, I always had a big picture, a bit like your slide there with the guy looking at the mountains and the lake. I'd always had a bigger picture of what I wanted to do, but I didn't know how to get there. So I was really driven by, obviously the pain, and I just didn't want to, do the next 30, 40 years and get to 55 and 60 and end up just doing the same thing. That was just my thought process. And I did have a bigger picture as well, Brenton, but, I'd had a lot of coaches, I guess, in the time, but no, I couldn't get anyone to show me how to achieve the outcomes that I wanted until I met Ed.
Yeah. So, Jamie, let's have a look at, I think we don't need to harp on this too much now. Like, for most people I can see in the list, and most of the regulars here will know the deep narrative structure fairly deeply by now. But did you want to just quickly touch on the importance of where the senior client manager fits into the structure, and then we'll move on to recruitment?
Yeah, so that, just a couple of things to point on is number one is, like, when you're creating these ideal teams, it's very important that one person is responsible for the clients. That's the critical thing. If you look at your own experience, right, in dealing with organisations, or, when you're buying a car, or you've got a buying experience, then there's nothing worse than having 2 or 3 people all chimed in to your experience and not knowing who to go through. So, I keep coming back to, just having one person who's accountable for the client. That's essentially why this is so important in the ideal team structure, Brent. Someone has to be responsible for the client, not 3 people. And the other point to that is, Ed always goes on about it, and we went through all this, is not sharing staff across teams, not sharing staff across, senior client managers as well. A lot of firms will do that, even the bigger firms, where you'll end up working for, 3 or 4 different managers, or you'll end up working for 2 different partners. And then, there's no clarity around reporting lines. There's no clarity around responsibility. When you look at this, when you build these teams and you look at these teams, they're mean, clean, productive teams, and the reporting lines are very direct, and there's leverage in them, so everyone learns. And in terms of the senior client manager, must have a high level of emotional intelligence, or a high level of interpersonal skills. Know how to manage clients' expectations, know how to manage client complaints. We all get complaints, but everyone does, or across the world in our industry. However, the important point is how you deal with the complaint. You know, do you deal with a complaint and blast on it on email, which is the worst thing you can do. So, you know, it's taking a measured response, managing the client's expectations is absolutely key. Yeah.
If one person is responsible for a client, does that not create a bottleneck for delivering work to the client or chasing information?
No, it's a good question. No, you know, Ed always refers to this to the resource mix, Aaron. And so in terms of the resource mix, a really good senior client manager will know how to delegate. You know, one of the best descriptions of high-level delegation is in Dr. Stephen Covey's book. Even there's, you know, stewardship, delegation. How do you delegate? Don't abdicate. So, Aaron, the key point is to have the work come in, obviously, but any time that a senior client manager does 100% of the job, it's the wrong way. So you have the less junior people on the team do the work, actually, you know, do the bank rec, prepare the financial statements. And so you have to know how to delegate it. And a lot of senior client managers, if they can't let go, if they're like a control freak is another word for it, then you'll get blockages. And so it's the owner's job, like my job, to help remove the blockages production. So where is it being held up? And, you know, you do that by simply asking the team questions. What are you stuck on? You know, where do you need help? And you'll soon find out where, you know, you have to be like a plumber, Ed says, and just remove the blockages to production, because we're not all the same. So different people need to do different work. So whether that's the finder, the minder, or the grinder, all equally as important as one another. But what you do is get complementary. They all got complementary skills, and you get synergy out of that. And the synergy equals 1 + 1. And, you know, I always go on about it, but, you know, there's the highest level of maturity and teamwork is interdependence. When you engage people in dialogue and you debate and you discuss to get the best outcome, that's when you'll get absolute synergy. And that's what these teams are all about, because, you know, there's dependence, which is where people are just dependent on one another. There's independence, which is sort of just like your sole trader. But then there's interdependence, and it's the highest level of maturity, working to a goal with other people. And that's what I always loved and always wanted to achieve. Yeah. And
just in terms of Aaron's question, Jamie, there's also the difference between the production traffic and the communication traffic. And it's not so much that the grinding team aren't able to communicate with the client directly, certainly if it's chasing information or whatever that may be.
Doing the production work.
Yeah, but there is a way of making sure that the senior client manager stays in the loop if other team members are going to speak to clients. How do you guys normally manage that?
Yeah, pretty easy, Brenton. So essentially, like a lot of the production work these days, you know, given technology, is just done with email. It's done with, you know, products like Carbon, you know, all sorts of different products. So, you know, often it's just the senior client manager being in the loop. And that's, you know, essentially it can be just a CC on an email, because, you know, the production work by its nature itself is just, well, give me the information and I can do the job. You know, when you need to advise the client of something, that's a different level of communication. That's like telling the client, well, you need to do X, Y, and Z. Whereas the production work, whether it's bookkeeping or tax, it's just over and over. It's year in, year out, year in, year out. And it's more, oh, I need this information, or I need to allocate this transaction somewhere. So as long as the senior client manager is over the communication and we're aware of the relationship, then you're fine.
Perfect.